Anyway, my feet kept me in Iqaluit for about 2.5 months. I guess from Christmas to the beginning of March, where I learned and I was in isolation because they were afraid because of I would get serious infections. It was a very weird time because I remember when they did my left foot, which was just the toes, ultimately, fortunately. It took a couple of weeks before I could start to see. I read enough about frostbite, because at night I would hobble out and find books, medical books, and read about frostbite and hypothermia and stuff. And I knew it might get better. I didn't know if it would get much better, but so I would hobble around and stuff, and they were very nice because they would bring in usually Arctic char for the Inuit patients. It was only a 32-bed hospital in Iqaluit, and so I would get char, and but I was in isolation because they were worried about infections. But the first time they wheeled me into surgery, they only told me they were going to just kind of, because all my toes had been compound fractured too, because I had been kicking them against the sled. I had no feeling below the knees. It was kind of like a long distance call between here and Mars. I would take a step, and about 3 seconds later I could feel in my knees that my foot was on the ground. Or if I tried to get off a sled, when we traveled back, because we decided, because of me, they were worried about me, we didn't stop after that first night. And so to rest, one guy, we would travel in pairs, and one guy would sit on the sled and nap for about an hour, and the other guy would walk, and then we'd switch so the guy didn't freeze. So half that trip back I walked, and I couldn't feel the ground. It's like, you know. Anyway, what was the story? I was what was I saying about the hospital? Geez, it was really interesting because I learned something about how the medical people treated Inuit, both good and bad. I mean, they were good physicians and good nurses and so on. But the guy who did my feet, he had been in a South African mining camp. The doctor in a South African mining camp, a really nice guy, but he didn't tell me. He just said he was going to even just check to see what, if infections were on. And I woke up and found they had taken off my toes on my left foot. So that was a shock. Also, as I say, I didn't leave the hospital for almost 2.5 months. When I was ready to leave, they had burned all my clothes because they were covered with blood, seal blood, and we were wearing the same thing all the time. I had no parka. So it was my first encounter with the Canadian medical system. I was a Northwest Territories resident, so I had a med card, and they even paid for my medevacs. They paid for a new parka and wind pants and stuff. So I've been eternally grateful ever since, appreciating the Canadian medical system, the insurance system. And anyway, I'm pretty certain I had no contact with Clyde River the entire time that I was in the hospital. I think I wrote one letter. I don't know if it ever got to anybody. It was supposed to go to Piumituk. But he didn't read English anyway, and I did not write syllabics. I still have difficulty reading syllabics. I have to keep the syllabary with me. And I'm sure they figured they'd never see me again. And when I got off the plane in March, everybody in Clyde was stunned. And this white guy's back. And then I got my dog team, and I went back to Abatiok. And that's where I got back to Abatiok in March, and everything I had read, Jeunesse and so on, the idea was that Inuit were nomadic. I came to think of Inuit as semi-sedentary, like the winter village was put where you could hunt seals all the time, and there was no dearth of polar bears. Clyde had the second highest polar bear quota in Canada at the time, and but then when May came, that's when we started to move. And that first summer, we moved camp 8 times. Caribou hunting, fishing, sealing, then back to Abatiuk to hunt narwhal, and so on. And so that was how I did my time. All the time keeping notes, of course, both on the, if you will, the food stuff. I didn't even think of it as food security or anything like that, or even as diet. I was just interested in terms of bioenergetics from the article I read from Bill Kemp. And then creating genealogies and kinship terminology, and I learned how to ask questions, and I learned that you had to be very precise, like asking someone, how many brothers and sisters did you have? I might only find out about the ones who lived in Clyde and didn't know they had relatives in Mitimatalik and a sister in Arctic Bay and someone in Kikatajuak. And but I really didn't have much contact with Clyde River in terms of working with the Inuit there. When people came out to visit or go hunting, they always stopped at Abatiuk. And in the summer, 2 of his brothers came. Piumituk became Isimata after his father died, just a few years before I arrived. And that was really interesting, because what stuck in my head was Damas's, if you will, his diagram of Inuit social structure, respect and obedience, and I can't remember the horizontal, the term he used at the time. But you could see the tension when an older brother became the head of the extended family. I mean, he was only a few years older than his next youngest brother. And he had kind of an iron hand, to be absolutely honest. For instance, Bill Kemp, who became my PhD supervisor, worked at Lake Harbor, and they had a camp head, pardon me, but each person did their own trading, for instance, at Hudson Bay. Piumituk did all the trading, and he told me it was his job to make sure everyone had what they needed. So when people ran out of the sugar and the flour they bought, they would come to him and they'd get a tobacco can of sugar, or a pan of flour for bannock, tobacco, and so on. But it was a very harmonious experience. And as I say, I mean, I had never thought of myself as a serious contributor to people's lives. And I've never thought we are particularly beneficial in the lives of Inuit, no matter what I've done or what, don't go in there with great expectations, because the government, the GNWT and now the GN, none of it is where good ideas go to die, basically. The government will kill anything. And I have my own theories about why. They're not nefarious at all. It's just that there's such a high turnover. Every white person's a transient, basically. And after 2.5 years, you're gone. And the next person, you don't get any points for trying to tweak a policy. You want a new policy. And it's the bane of Nunavut. Anyway, let me flip the page.
You refer at the camp when you...
Yeah, I was at Abatiuk, and it was basically a routine. I mean, I may have gone in there with sort of this romantic notion of going around with Inuit and so on, but after you spend a week at minus 30 out on the ice every day for 10 or 12 hours, there's no romance left. You're so glad to get back in the kamak and have uyuk and stuff, and it was really interesting. But Also, I was at an age where I was really impressionable about all sorts of things. And one was you know, I was really struck at how Inuit, how cohesive. To be honest with you, I have virtually, I won't say I don't have any family, but I have very little contact with my family on either side over time. And yet I feel much more akin with Inuit. And over 50 years have, you know, there are extended families that in some way I have one foot in one extended family and a hand in this extended family and so on. And whoever I hunt with, I still give them all the food, and I can just come take food when I want, like anyone else. So, but I guess I must have flown out sometime in October to come back south, expecting to go to McMaster. And I got to Montreal, and I called Dave Damas, and the government in Ontario had not funded a PhD program in anthropology. It was going to come in a year. And I said, well, I don't want to kill a year. And I was staying at the airport out in Dorval. So I came into campus. I went to the anthropology department. And to be absolutely honest with you, they expressed absolutely no interest in me. No one, it was before James Bay. So no one was interested in the North, basically. Everybody was working for the World Bank in Africa or Latin America. But I heard somebody mention Bill Kemp's name, and he was here in geography. So I walked over, and we backdated an application. I was in geography, and that's how I came to be in the Department of Geography. And the only thing was, I said, I'll get my own money, and so you don't feel like you have to support me. And it's a British-style graduate program, so there's virtually no coursework, so nobody ever knew I wasn't a geographer. I mean, it didn't make a damn bit of difference. So I wound up teaching courses on the North and in cultural ecology, stuff I knew. It in some ways lived, you know. And the other part of the agreement was that I would write my thesis on Inuit kinship and social organization. And the only thing geographic would be about it was Clyde River and Northwest Territories. And that was it. And that's what I did. And that was the book that came out through the Mercury series. And I used my time when I got back. I was pretty intellectually hungry, and not just for anthropology, but how to intellectually organize some of this stuff. And I got into systems theory. Particularly Kenneth Boulding, but also Brillant and Van Bertalanffy. And so it kind of became a mix. And systems theory had entered archaeology as well. So when I looked back at the literature I had missed for the last year and a half, I was getting more and more of the systems stuff, cybernetics. And so I decided that would be a good way to organize what I came back with, you know. And so I latched onto the idea of, I always considered my thesis, my dissertation, a thesis in cultural ecology. What was, I would say, at that time, relatively original, or at least novel, was that social organization was an adaptive mechanism. Now that's commonplace. But when you picked up anything on cultural ecology, it was about technology and space, you know. So, and I didn't want to go that way. And I never included any of the, you know, energy stuff or stuff, really any hunting stuff, seriously, because I was intellectually much more interested in trying to think through the centrality of kinship and in social organization and how social organization permeated everything. And to be absolutely honest with you, my entire career has been focused on what we call in English sharing, because that is the material manifestation of kinship and social relationships. amongst. To put it in a crass way, it's the currency of traditional Inuit life. So every few years I publish another paper as I learn more. I still consider myself with an unfinished dissertation, to be absolutely honest. And I mean, in a way, I'm glad I didn't know then what I know now, because what would I do? I hate to say it, but so you have a question, you know, the role of kinship in social organization. It's everything. In fact, I think one of the major problems in contemporary Inuit life is the sedentarization and gradual, the explosion of population, even in communities like Clyde, which was 200 people when I went there, and is probably unofficially, well, officially probably about 1,300 people. Unofficially, it's 1,600 people, with all the couch surfing and so on. Is that, in a way, you're probably familiar with Wim's book, Too Many People, is that there are too many people, and it is disrupt. For instance, when I came to Clyde, no one used personal names. You use kinship terms, or you found a term. And now to hear children refer to their parents by name, to me, is still shocking, because what it connotes is a breakdown in authority. And Michael, you might know Michael Crowell's work. Michael, I gave him courses in kinship and social organization and so on. Suicide depresses me so much. And so many of my friends' children have committed suicide, and some of their pictures are there. But what I tried to impress on Michael, and I don't know if it ever got through, is along with, you know, even I was still at Clyde when they had arranged marriages. It was just at the tail end of that. And I saw what happened when a woman refused to marry the man she was promised to. The social isolation from her family. I mean, her whole extended family would not speak with her. Eventually she capitulated and married the guy. And they've been together ever since. But this idea of, it wasn't just, you know, what most people talk about, you know, the culture shock, the this, the that, of being around Kalina or whatever. I think there are some things there, but overall, it has been the erosion of what kinship brought to organizing Inuit life. Even hunting with neighbors is not the same as hunting with your kinsmen, because you always know who you can depend on, not just out on the ice, but for spare parts, for food, and so on. And most of the elders, well, at the time when I came to Clyde, there was no one over 60. People were very short-lived. But, you know, throughout the time, all the time in Clyde, I mean, I spent all my time with the older people and the people in my own age cohort as well. I'm embarrassed to say that I know very few people under 20 by name. I have to ask, in some cases, who their grandparents are to really place them. And I felt badly about this. And then I was fixing a snowmobile with a friend of mine about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And these kids came by and they said, "Hello, Jamesy. Hello, Georgie." And I didn't recognize them. And I turned to Jamesy and I said, "Who are those kids?" He said, "I don't know. There are too many kids in this village." And so ever since then, I haven't tried to keep up my genealogies. They're just too fast for me. But, you know, even the concept of subsistence, I think over time, although it took me quite a long time, I don't think of subsistence as an economic system. I think of it as a cultural system. I think of what Inuit economy is a social economy, and that is underpinned by kinship. Subsistence, I don't like it being used for the term economy because it connotes poverty, as we use it here. And it's incredibly rich. It has rules, just like any economy, and it has ways of sanctioning people. So I use the term subsistence. Sometimes I'll use non-cap S to mean what people mean by economy. And I'll use capital S to mean culture, Inuit subsistence culture. And I don't care whether it catches on with anyone else, but I know what I mean, and that's what I have inculcated in my students. And so I would say from the first year I was in Clyde River, certainly all my work in Clyde, even though I may have gone up to do reconstruct the demography of the coast in the 20th century and so on, always comes back to that. For one thing, I either was living with people in people's houses or tenting in the summer, and people would come visit me. I used to tent up at the Water Lake. As I got old enough around 1995, and I didn't feel like living in tents anymore, I built cabins. There was just a cabin subculture developing in the North at that time. Now everybody has cabins. It was only rich people who had cabins, and then people would aggregate around them, and that would disrupt the social organization as well, because you had to live with somebody who had access to fuel and so on. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. I think I'm okay, but not smoking enough, that's the problem. So I find it hard to elaborate. Conceptually, to me, subsistence is much more than we typically use the term. And I find it a tragedy that so little time is spent in anthropology on kinship and social organization. And I used to, in my human ecology course, it was a crash course in, if you will, the social side of ecology. And then there was some bioenergetics, decision making. I even pilfered stuff from the optimal foragers. Although I find optimal foraging theory, what interests me about it is when it doesn't work. When the predictions just don't work. And it happens a lot more frequently than the optimal foragers think. So, and Eric Smith would hate me. And other things that were formative, I've worked in a lot of places. There are only 3 places in Nunavut I've never been. I've never been in Kugarak, which I'd like to. I tried to land there once and couldn't get in. Never been back. I've never been to Repulse, and I've always wanted to go to Repulse Naya. And I've never been to Cape Dorset, but I've never wanted to go there. So, but I'm just looking, you've got some things here like an evaluation of native harvest survey. In 1974, I had a break from the North. I was arrested in the States for refusing to go in the Army. Apparently I was drafted on Baffin Island when I was on Baffin Island. I never saw the draft notice. Apparently I was drafted sometime in 1971. In any case, I flew down to see my wife's parents with her and was arrested in O'Hare Airport. And just fortunately, it was the summer Nixon resigned, and the federal judge said he couldn't in good conscience sentence me to prison. I pled guilty. I said, what can I say? In a sense, I broke the law just by coming to Canada without informing the draft board, although eventually they were informed. So I was on probation, and I worked as a janitor in a mental hospital in New Hampshire, where I actually brought together all my field notes from a couple of years in Clyde. It was the easiest job I've ever had in my life, actually. I had a lot of downtime. As long as you washed the floors twice a day, it didn't matter. It was a good experience in many ways. But when I finished and I was coming back to Canada, before I did the stint in New Hampshire, I went to the Canadian consulate in Chicago and asked them if it would disrupt my landed immigrant status. And he said no, because I had not committed a crime of moral turpitude. So anyway, to come back, I figured I needed work. I was coming back to the program, but I heard that the Committee for Original Peoples Entitlement was looking for people. It was the Berger hearings time in the West. And so I wrote to them, and they said, well, we need somebody to work on the health system. So I flew up to Inuvik, and I wound up living with Peter Rusher. And our job was, going around to all the communities in the Delta. So I went to places at what was then Holmen, Ulahattuk, Sax Harbor. I mean, I've never seen a place like Sax. I've never seen people so wealthy in my life, although maybe Cape Dorset might rival it. But that was an interesting experience, for one thing, because my job was to look at what would be the impact on the health infrastructure if you had 10,000 migrant workers coming in, things like that. And so writing stuff up for presentation for for Berger's hearings and so on. And that spun off into things like keeping on the land. That actually was done for the Nunavut land claim. 5 of us were asked by Tungavik Federation of Nunavut to develop essentially a harvester support plan, which never made it into the land claim. In fact, I still have a letter where the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs says, this is a social program. We don't fund social programs. So I could dig that out someplace, I'm sure, although I'm pretty lax with my correspondence. So, that there's a period there in the 80s where almost anything, I came back to a different time. It was a consultant's time. So I worked for COPE for about 3-4 months, whatever. Came back south, and at that time, I think we had switched to, I was being funded by the National Museum of Canada, salvage ethnology stuff. So I did stuff on demography of the east coast of Baffin Island and so on. And then I took a consulting job with TransCanada Pipelines, Polar Gas. And that brought me to the high Arctic, to Resolute Bay, Grise Fjord, and Somerset Island, where I spent most of my time on Somerset Island. I hated Resolute Bay. Liked Grise Fjord, but it's a little small. And the only place I could live was the jail. It was the only open place. They didn't have a lot of crime in Grise Fjord. There was only about 110 people at the time. And did some hunting around there. Did my first muskox hunt with people. The same thing, you gave food away and so on. And so there was somebody from Clyde actually had moved up there because his wife had died, and they felt he was getting a little too fond of young women, and they bought him a ticket and sent him to his brother's place in Grise Fjord. And Resolute was just a horror show because of all the consulting and stuff. I mean, it was just terrible for Inuit. 800 white people and 150 Inuit, and it was just awful. So I spent most of my time on Somerset Island at Kuganayak. There was an old man there. We're reaching the end of time for this segment. I'll pick it up next time, but just to say, he had moved there in the 1920s after the Janes murder trial and raised 2 families there. And I'll stop there for the moment.